Limnology. He's a research scientist over there. And I think, Zach, with that, I will turn it over to you. Maybe I'll just say, he's got expertise in freshwater systems, field work, modeling work, different stressors and forcings on those systems. And I will now turn it over to you and let you give your presentation. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation to present. Thanks everybody for being here and everybody online for tuning in. So today I'm going to be kind of talking about a couple of different stories. I am with the Center for Limnology. I'm also partly with the Wisconsin DNR as a fisheries scientist. So today I'm going to be talking about some really amazing science that we're doing, but also thinking more about the management side. So at the last half of the talk, I'm going to put my DNR hat on a little bit and talk about how we think about climate adaptation in terms of fisheries management. Probably not news to anybody in the room, right? But Wisconsin's climate is changing. I like to start a lot of talks with this cool graph. This is a shiny app that some folks put together, and you can essentially type in the location, and it gives you a sort of heat map for what the projected weather is going to be like in 2080. So if you type in central Wisconsin, by 2080, we're looking at something like northern Missouri, right? I was just down in St. Louis a couple weeks ago, or central Illinois, which kind of gross if you're Wisconsinite, right? You don't get any snow, you can't ice fish, it's not very fun. But this is where we're headed, and we're expecting changes in things like precipitation and temperature over time, or how much that's changed in the past. And we're expecting that to continue to change in the future. And with those changes, we're expecting a new kind of less predictable environment in Wisconsin in the future, right? So we have, warming, which I think everybody kind of has sense of, or is, called global warming. But with that warming, we're also going to experience more extreme events, right? Flooding, storms, polar vortexes, that kind of stuff. We're also in aquatic systems thinking a lot about how it's going to create novel conditions in our lakes and rivers. More algae blooms, different types of algae like cyanobacteria, and what that causes to the food webs in those aquatic ecosystems. And then finally, another stressor we're thinking about is seasonal disruption, right? We live in a seasonal environment, it gets cold and then it warms up. Changes in the timing of those things and the severity of those changes are really important for how these ecosystems function. If those seasonal changes get disrupted, that can cause some disconnects in our ecosystems. So what this talk is really going to be about is kind of in two parts. How is this new, less predictable environment going to be affecting our fisheries? I'm a fisheries ecologist by training, so we're going to be talking a lot about fish today. And what do we do about it? And one thing I realized as I was making this slide is that, these two bullet points are in the future tense. And the future is here, right? Climate change is already affecting our fisheries. So how this talk is going to really focus on how these effects are already taking place in our aquatic ecosystems. And the second part of the talk is going to be focusing on, what are we doing about it, right? We've got to be thinking about how to handle this stuff now. It's no longer in the future, it's happening. So I could give a talk all about, how climate change is affecting Wisconsin fisheries, right? There are lots of different impacts. I'm the co-chair of the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts Wiki Fisheries Working Group, and in the last kind of big assessment report, we highlighted a lot of these different impacts. So for example, there's going to be a lot of negative impacts here in red on our cold water fish. So things like brook trout, which are only native stream trout in Wisconsin, we're projected to lose maybe 2/3 of its habitat in our state. Right, really big loss of habitat for those cold water fish. Walleye, a lot of people like to eat walleye in our state. They've been declining in recruitment. In other words, the number of kind of baby fish they make every year. That number has been going down over time. Again, we think that's due to climate impacts in addition to some other effects. And then down here on the bottom, hopefully folks in the back can see that Cisco, or cold water fish that live in a lot of our inland lakes. We've lost about 1/3 of those populations already, and we're projected to lose maybe 80% of our populations in total. So you're looking at potentially extirpation entirely in our state of a cold water fish, right? Really big negative impacts. But climate change is not only going to have negative impacts, some things are going to become more frequent with climate change, right? So whether we want them to or not. So for example, we're projected to have more fish kills in our state, more heat waves, less oxygen in our water, more fish kills, particularly in the southern part of the state. That's what these kind of more red points are showing. We're projected to see more warm water fish. If you really like bass here on the top or bluegill here on the bottom, you might be pretty happy about that. But if you're not too into warm water fish species, maybe you're not. And then we also might see more species invasions. The interesting thing about Wisconsin in terms of kind of aquatic invaders is we actually get pretty cold in the winter, and that limits a lot of invasions from more southern kind of warm water species. And this is just an example of a paper I worked on a couple years ago, where if we project river and stream temperatures forward, a lot of our rivers actually become habitable for things like invasive carps. So those are the ones that jump out of the water and bash you in the head. You see videos of that in like Illinois. These guys are headed northward, and a warming climate's gonna help them do that. So I could give a talk about all of these negative effects, and you know what, in the end, it's gonna get pretty dark, right? Like I could go through and say, yeah, we're looking at lots of losses of cold water species and what's next on the horizon. I've given that talk before. It's not super effective, I will admit, right? It's all doom and gloom. I gave that talk at a Fisheries Club meeting a while ago. I barely got out of there with my life. So we're gonna be trying to tell a little bit more nuanced story today. The first one is really kind of focusing on the science, as I said. So seasonal disruptions in our climate and how that affects our aquatic ecosystems. And the second part, as I mentioned, I'm going to be kind of putting my DNR hat on and thinking about how we're talking about how we're thinking about adaptation to climate change, particularly relevant to fisheries management. So the first part, let's talk about some science, and we're going to talk about the science of phenology today. So phenology, if you're not familiar with that term, is really the study of kind of cyclical or natural seasonal phenomena, right? So you think about when new flowers bloom in the spring, when do the leaves change color in the fall, when do birds migrate, when do fish spawn. Those are all phenological phenomena that we can think about and study, and phenology is really about how the timing of those things change and what the impacts of those changes in timing mean for those species or those ecosystems. And the reason we care about phenology, or I think you should care about phenology, is it informs how you interact with the natural world, whether you know it or not, right? So an example I like to give, I like to go out and pick morel mushrooms. These are an edible mushroom that grow in the spring in Wisconsin. I have some family land out in Sauk County. It's like an hour and a half away. I can't just walk out the back door and see if the mushrooms are there, right? But there's all these really interesting kind of traditional sources of knowledge that say, oh, when dandelions are in all three phases, that's when the morels are out. Or when the lilacs are blooming, that's when the morels are out, right? So you're using one phenological cue, dandelions, to inform another phenological event, morel mushrooms. And that's a really small example of how we always are using information about the seasonality of our environment to tell us what's going on, what has happened, and what's coming, right? Another really important example that's going to be relevant for the talk today is the walleye spawn. So in the northern third of the state, we have the Ojibwe tribes that have a really important, very long-standing relationship with walleye. They have a spring harvest fishery. They go out and they capture these fish. It's culturally important. It's also important for subsistence. It's a major source of protein in the spring for them, kind of as the spring starts to warm up. And there's traditional ecological knowledge that they're basing, when to go out and look for fish in the lake when things like spring peepers are singing, or when the ice goes off. Again, using one phenological cue to inform kind of your relationship with another seasonally abundant resource, right? And you can imagine if those cues start to divide, what that can do with your ability to predict what's happening in your environment. And the last thing I'll say, it's also really relevant for management, right? So for example, bass spawn in the springtime. They're really susceptible to angling in the spring. So we might close the fishery in the spring, or only do catch and release fishing, reduce pressure on those fish while they're spawning. Same thing in the opposite direction for deer, right? They reproduce in the fall. It's a rut. They're really active. That's also when the fawns leave the does. That's when we hunt the deer, right? So we're informing our hunting seasons, our fishing seasons on the phenology of these different animals. So that's kind of the sense of why I think phenology is so important. It's informing everything you do, kind of whether you're conscious of it or not. So the specific kind of phenologic cue I'm going to be talking about today is ice seasons in our lakes, right? So our ice season is, and I'm thinking mostly about ice off, so when the ice melts in the springtime. We have a lot of evidence that our ice seasons are getting much shorter, and the ice off is occurring earlier in the year, and that's what this plot on the left is showing. So we have some really amazing data sets from the North Temperate Lakes Long-Term Ecological Research Project that's run out of the CFL. A century or more down here in Mendota, 40 or 50 years up here in the northern lakes. This is Escanaba Lake, which is in Vilas County, and Sparkling Lake, which is also up there. And you can kind of see long-term ice off is getting earlier and earlier. That's what these negative slopes mean. And if we project that forward, we are kind of on the edge of where, with a little bit of warming, and we passed 1.5 degrees already. This is with a little bit of 2 degrees warming, which is in the purple. We're looking at an era of intermittent ice. We may not have our lakes freeze every year, right? Last year is a great example. crazy low ice year. Nobody could ice fish. I was miserable because I like to ice fish, right? We had a crazy year where the ice went off and then went back on and then came back off in Trout Lake. First time it's ever happened, right? So we're looking at a very different ice season in our lakes with just a little bit more warming. So the other aspect of ice off, we all say, okay, spring's getting earlier, fine, makes sense, is that it's also getting increasingly unpredictable. This is something that we have really just started to look at in the last few years. So this is the same data. Now we're just taking a rolling variance in those ice off dates. And what I just want you to note is how you get much more variance in the last couple of decades, right? It's not just that things are trending earlier, they're starting to wiggle a lot more. And a great example of that is actually from about a decade ago now. In 2012, we ended our winter assembly in February up at Trout Lake when we put a truck through the ice, right? So we put a truck through the ice in February at Trout Lake, which is in Miles County up north, right? You should be able to drive a tank on the ice in February up there, right? So crazy early ice out. Official ice out date was March 20th in 2012. And 1 year later, in 2013, the ice didn't go off until May 10th. So there was still snow on the ground. The students were wrapping up their semesters, getting ready to go up and do their summer field work, and there's still ice on the lakes on May 10th up there. So that's a 50-day difference from 1 year to the next. So you can imagine what that means for an ecosystem that's used to the ice going off in mid-April, and all of a sudden you're doing this, 2 months difference from 1 year to the next, and what the implications of that are. And this is really important because lake ice, or lakes, have a kind of ecological memory of lake ice is the way we like to think about it, right? When the ice goes off in the spring, it can affect a lot of different ecological processes that go on in that lake for the rest of the year. So the ice goes off, you get heat, you get wind, right, going into the lake. So the differences in timing of ice off can affect how much your lake warms up, how much oxygen is available, what the primary productivity is, how much algae is in the lake. All these different processes can be influenced by the kind of ecological memory of when the ice goes off the lake. So the reason we care about this and this variability in ecological memory is because it can have really strong impacts on food web processes. So the idea here is you can actually have mismatches in different parts of the food web. So I'm going to have a cartoon to kind of give you an example of what I mean. So say, for example, we have an average ice off, the ice melts off the lake. Here's my fake lake over here. You get sunlight, you get heat, right? That spurs an algae bloom. And then you have zooplankton that kind of hatch or emerge. They're there, they eat the algae, they start to reproduce, they're happy. Fish hatch, these larval fish or little tiny fish, they're eating the zooplankton. So they're growing, they're surviving, they're happy. This is a food web that works. Everything is matched up, right? The next kind of level of the food web comes along when there's peak abundance of the previous one. Where this unpredictability in ice off becomes important is, say you have now a really early ice off. Ice goes off really early, you get that sudden heat. That sudden heat spurs zooplankton, algae. But now, because this is way earlier than usual, zooplankton can't keep up with that. The algae starts to die back before the zooplankton can take advantage of it as a food resource. You get less zooplankton, baby fish hatch, and there's nothing to eat. So they don't survive and they don't grow, right? Now you have a mismatch between these different parts of the food web. And this is the kind of concerns we have with how changes in phenology are going to influence entire food webs. You have mismatches between these different kind of trophic links, and it changes how energy can flow through the food web. So that's the kind of like foundational idea of some of the research I'm going to be talking about next. Because we are really interested on the effects of increasingly unpredictable phenology on walleye. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of concern about walleye. Their recruitment has been declining over time. There's been less productive, populations. We really care about that because people really love walleye in our state. I swear they're on like every other year of our fishing regs cover. That's all the time. This is actually my boss's son. He made the cover a few years ago. So they're important recreationally, also critical for our tribal populations, right? This is a very long-standing relationship. It's very important to the tribes. And the way we manage walleye is actually jointly managed in the northern part of the state, between the state and the tribes, to ensure that they're able to access that resource. So we're seeing declines in walleye recruitment, and if you look down here in this kind of light purple, that's walleye harvest in our recreational fishery. We're seeing that response in the harvest too, so harvest is generally going down. So the question, or the concern about this, is coming from the fact that walleye are springtime spawners, they spawn seasonally. So changes in phenology could influence their ability to reproduce. So just kind of a quick primer on walleye. They spawn in the spring. Their eggs kind of down in kind of rocky areas. They hatch into larvae. The availability of food and temperature can influence the survival of those larvae. And then we go out and catch them in the fall when they look like this. So when I talk about walleye recruitment, I'm talking about the number of those guys we see in our surveys in the fall, just so you have a sense of what that means. And we think walleye spawning is related to things like ice off or temperature or photo period, right? But despite the importance of all these things, or the importance of the species to us, we actually don't really know. So that's part of what this research is designed to answer. But the basic question we had was like, okay, ice off is getting more and more variable. We are concerned about that because we might see more and more mismatches. So are essentially walleye experiencing phenological whiplash, right? Are they having a hard time adapting to our increasingly variable seasonal environment? And I'll kind of jump over a lot of methodological stuff, but we were able to look at this in 194 lakes across northern Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan. This was a paper that we just published this past year in Limnology and Oceanography Letters. And when we looked at kind of how ice off was changing and how walleye spawning was changing, we found that they were diverging, right? Ice off, as you might expect, is getting earlier over time. Excuse me. But walleye spawning phenology, so the timing when the walleye were spawning, was not changing. They were staying pretty invariant. They were not responding to this earlier and earlier ice off cue. So what this means is that in later years, walleye are starting to fall behind. There's a larger and larger mismatch over time between kind of this really important, right, for lake ecosystems cue, ice off, and what the walleye were doing. When we looked at that difference itself and how it changed over time, sure enough, it's getting larger and larger. So now we're up to about a 10-day mismatch, where back in the 60s it was maybe 3 or 4 days. And then when we related this, and now we're going to take this part and put it on the x-axis, to recruitment, so that's the number of baby walleye that are on in the fall, what we found is a really strong negative relationship. And I always like to pop up this triangle. There's no points up here, right? So when we have big mismatches between ice off and walleye, or big mismatches from average conditions, we don't get big year classes of walleye, right? You only see lots of baby walleye when stuff is pretty close to average, is what this relationship is showing. So right away, we're getting the idea that walleye are feeling the effects of phenological whiplash. When you have big whiplashes, when you have big extremes in when the ice goes off the lake, you tend not to see very good walleye recruitment in the following, or the subsequent fall, right? So if you have lots of, and these mismatches are getting more frequent mismatches, more kind of bust years for walleye, that might be influencing their ability to kind of sustain themselves over the long haul. This could be a really important aspect of their spawning ecology that we really haven't looked at in much detail so far. But like all good science, this actually just leads to further questions, right? What's going on here? Why aren't they able to track ice off? And why is this, right? I mean, sure, it's kind of phenomenological, but what are the mechanisms behind that? What's happening in early life that's leading to this mismatch and leading to this really strong negative relationship? So that's the kind of next question that we decided to pursue. And this really kind of has its basis, and I'm going to give you guys kind of a crash course on fisheries ecology for 1 second, and fish recruitment. So fish recruitment, the general idea is fish make a lot of eggs, they just kind of spray offspring everywhere. There's some kind of bottleneck where environmental conditions have to be about right for those eggs or larvae to survive, and everybody that makes it through this bottleneck, that's the next generation, right? And the reason fish recruitment can be so hard to untangle is if we don't really know what's going on here, little tiny changes, when you have a gazillion eggs, tiny changes in the percent of fish that make it through that bottleneck can yield huge changes in the number of fish that make up your next generation. So that's why it's really important to try and understand what's happening in this bottleneck. And there are lots of different hypotheses. So for example, for walleye, you can have match and mismatch dynamics like I just talked about. Influence of water temperature, water clarity, precipitation, extreme events, right? There are lots of different things that can happen during these bottlenecks that can result in good or bad year classes of walleye or other species. So it's okay, we need to figure out what this critical period is, but the question, that just leads to a question of like, well, how do you define what a critical period is in the first place, right? So say you have some time series of water temperature data. So this is 4 years of water temperatures in Escanaba Lake. Where would you put your critical period for walleye recruitment is the question that we're trying to answer here. And if you look back at the literature, there are lots of different ways folks have done it. One would be, just use an annual measure, average growing degree days, average temperature over the year, right? Not really a critical period, just kind of gets at the average conditions for that year. Another option might be to use something static. So maybe we do May water temperatures or variation in May water temperatures. May is a human construct, right? So that doesn't, you could be capturing stuff before ice off or way after ice off, depending on what kind of year it is. So maybe that's not really valuable as a critical period. You could do shifting measures, right? So maybe you base it off of ice off, right? But that still can capture maybe you do 0 to 30 days. That still is kind of an arbitrary standard. You just pick 30 days or 10 days or 50 days or whatever. And that's still capturing a lot of different types of years in different ways, right? So we had this idea, well, maybe this critical period is kind of a moving threshold, a moving target. And we need to think about this from a more ecological perspective to try and understand how this is influencing walleye recruitment. So the idea here is, well, if we know more about walleye spawning phenology, can we define better critical periods for walleye recruitment? And we think, like I said, ice off, temperature, and photo period are affecting when these guys spawn. And we think temperature and precipitation are two of the variables that influence recruitment. So can we put these two pieces together and try to identify what that bottleneck is and how important it is? So these are the questions we'll be talking about next. Essentially what drives spawning activity in walleye. Like I said, really important species, but we still really don't know. We know they spawn in the spring, but they spawn at pretty variable times. What's cueing that spawning activity? What is this bottleneck? What are the critical periods for temperature or precipitation? Critical temperature or precipitation periods for walleye recruitment success what are critical temperature or precipitation periods? In other words, are there periods of time where temperature or precipitation is unusually or unexpectedly important for walleye recruitment? And third, the next question is, well, if climate is changing, maybe those critical periods are also changing, right? Maybe it used to be right after spawning, maybe now it's 2 months after spawning. So can we look at that and ask, is that changing with changes in climate? So just to kind of touch on the data really quickly, now we're not looking across the entire state of Wisconsin, but we're just focusing on one lake, which is Escanaba Lake. Escanaba Lake has a DNR research station on it. It's one of the best studied lakes in the entire world. We have amazing fisheries data that goes all the way back to 1947, which is when they built the research station up there. So if you want to know something about walleye, chances are, if you read a paper that talks about walleye, chances are it includes Escanaba Lake data in it. There's a gazillion papers that look at Escanaba Lake. We're using this really amazing rich data set where they have walleye surveys, spring spawners, that's us collecting eggs from a walleye, and this is the kind of fyke net we use to collect them. From 1947 to present, we also look at fall recruitment, daily surface water temperature, and we have some predicted under ice temperatures there, and we also have precipitation data. So we have everything we need to think about these critical periods. So just to give you a sense of the data, so now this is day of year, and these are the kind of catches of female walleye by year. Each of these kind of shapes of the year. I just think this is a fun graph to look at because you can see how it's sliding earlier over time, but it's also getting more and more variable, right? But we're essentially asking, well, what explains each of these kind of domes, right? Can we predict can we figure out what predicts kind of peak catches of walleye in a given year? And to do that, I'm not going to get into the methods too much. We're using HGAM, so hierarchical generalized additive models, and we're including photoperiod, water temperature, and precipitation to try and model catches of walleye. So what we found is pretty interesting. One, we found that water temperature, photoperiod, and their interaction are all really significant in explaining catches. Their precipitation didn't matter. Cold showers aren't a turn off for walleye, so that's a good thing to know. We also were able to explain 70% of the variation in walleye catches. So if you're in ecology, you get an R squared of like 70%, that's crazy. So we're really happy with this model. And I'll just kind of go through the results here one by one. These are all partial effects plots. So in other words, across, with varying the predictor variable, we can see how strong of an effect it has. on the predictor. And what we find is that water temperature, as you might expect, kind of sort of dome-shaped. Most of the spawning happens between 5 and 15 degrees Celsius. But what's interesting is that photo period, much stronger dome, much stronger effect, right? You gotta be between 13.5, 14.5 hours of daylight for it to see walleye spawning. Precipitation, no effect. And this interaction between photo period and water temperature seem to be really important. This is actually the strongest effect we had in the model. And the thing I want to point out is you see, so brighter colors here are more walleye in our nets, essentially, more spawning activity. And what you see is that with across photo periods, going up and down, you see that fall off, right? You get past 14.5 hours, you get lower numbers. You get down here below 13.5 or so hours, you get lower numbers. You see that kind of very sharp dome. But you don't see much fall off with water temperature. So I will say a lot of times we think of water temperature as kind of the master variable for walleye spawning. This is saying that's not it, right? It's actually photo period is driving a lot of this, and water period or water temperature, excuse me, is kind of moderating the effective photo period. So we actually have our answers, so that's why we see this, right? If they're using photo period to a much greater extent than we think, that's why they're not following ice off. Right? Ice off is a temperature-dependent cue. It doesn't matter if it's been 14 hours or 12 hours of daylight. You've got to get to a certain temperature for the ice to melt, right? But if walleye are really paying much more attention to photo period, that would explain why they're pretty invariant compared to how much ice off has changed. But this does mean that our mental model for what's important for walleye spawning is kind of wrong, right? We're thinking about temperature way too much, and it's actually photo period. And if it's photo period, that means they're not able to adapt as quickly to changes in temperature, changes in ice off. It might make them more vulnerable to the effects of changes in phenology. So this brings us to the next question, kind of the next two questions combined. Okay, so we kind of know what drives walleye spawning activity. So let's predict when walleye should be spawning, or we think walleye are spawning, and then use that to try and inform when these critical periods are happening for walleye recruitment. And I'm just going to kind of go into the stats on this a little bit. I think it's cool. I'm kind of a quantitative person, so I think this is pretty interesting. It's also going to be really useful for thinking of other seasonal trends where you're trying to figure out when's the driver happen that causes X or Y. So again, the idea here is we're trying to identify critical periods. So say you have a bunch of years of different time series of a predictor variable, which is water temperature here. We're using this climate windows approach. So essentially the idea is you fit windows to every possible kind of space in that predictor variable, and then you fit a model. So for example, you might kind of pick one window, right? Take the mean of that, and you fit a model. So say this is mean temperature against walleye recruitment. And then you pick another random variable window and you do it again, and then you do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again, and you don't have to do this manually, Back does it for you, it takes forever. But the idea is after a while, you get a whole bunch of models and you look at them all and go, oh, that one fits pretty well. So if you're like me, you know, that is the ugliest, data dredgiest way to do this, right? Of course you're gonna get something that looks important if you fit literally thousands of possible windows. But the one thing I really want to point out, which is really important, is that you then do some kind of testing against randomized data. So what you're essentially doing is you randomize the data, you do this whole thing over again, it takes forever, and you look at what you actually observed, which is this dashed line, against the distribution of AIC scores or some other sort of kind of model fit from the randomized data. If your data are no different than random, that's a spurious effect. If your effect is pretty different from random, right, here's your observed effect, here's the random effect, the stuff from the randomized data, that suggests that that's a true signal, right? So this is what we're kind of doing to kind of feel our way through all these different possible models. So the way we did this is we kind of used that previous model, that GAM, to predict when walleye spawn. And then we fit all possible windows 120 days before and 150 days after spawning with walleye recruitment as the response variable. And we're looking for water temperature and precipitation signals, right? So what does it mean water temperature? What does it mean precipitation within each of these windows? We let those relationships be either linear or quadratic, right? So you could see a scenario where too cold or too hot is bad, right? So you could get nonlinear relationships between these variables. And for the last part, do critical periods change? We then repeated this whole thing, but we broke up the time series into 3 different kind of categories, right? So we had a past, which is 58 to 83, kind of a middle time series, and a present time series. So when you run this analysis, you get something that looks like this, which is a heat map. So this is when the kind of critical period window closes, and when the critical period opens. And brighter colors are better models, so stronger effects. So this is the very first thing I ran. This is the temperature critical periods across all years. And there are 2 kind of hot spots that pop out. One, temperature seems to be really important during spawning, and the other, temperature seems to be really important about a month after spawning, which makes amazing sense, right? Right during spawning, and then as the fish are kind of larvae, they're in this transitioning phase. I thought this was amazing. I did it. Like, I solved walleye recruitment, right? So I'm writing my nature paper, and the randomization is running, taking forever, and then finally it finishes, I make the plot, and these are totally spurious. These are no different than random. So that's the way science goes, back to the drawing board, but we didn't really see any temperature critical periods. The other thing we didn't see is any precipitation critical periods either. So across the entire time series, no effects. So we didn't see anything across the whole time series. Have they changed over time? I'm just going to show you a couple of tables. All you're left to do is focus on the p-values. There are no significant ones, right? We didn't see any temperature critical periods across any of the time periods that we looked at. Same deal for precipitation, except for one. There is one critical period in the most recent years is quadratic relationship with precipitation, between precipitation and improvement, which is pretty interesting. Just to kind of prove my point, here's for that model, the observed kind of AIC, and here's from the randomized data. So you can see it's pretty different from what the randomized data look like. So it's telling us this might be a true signal. So if you look at the heat map, there's our hotspot. It's about 6 to 19 days after spawning, right? So this is kind of right when eggs are either just about to hatch or just after they've hatched. And the relationship looks like this. It's a really strong negative relationship until you get out past cumulatively about 2 inches of rain, right? So more rainy springs, more precipitation, bad for walleye recruitment. So what does this mean to kind of sum all this stuff up? One is that, as we mentioned, walleye are feeling effects of phenological change via poor recruitment. And part of the reason they're feeling those effects is because they're using this photo period cue to time their spawning, and that's not allowing them to adapt or respond as quickly to changes in temperature or changes in ice off as they need to. Mismatches are probably important, that really negative effect between kind of mismatch and recruitment. However, we're working on the exact mechanism. We've got 4 years of larval fish sampling. Turns out larval walleye are really hard to catch, but we're working on actually what are they eating, what are they doing during this really early life period to try and understand those mismatch effects. The other thing I'll point out, we didn't see very many critical periods, right? We only saw that one. That might mean that things like biotic interactions, so predator-prey relationship between walleye and perch, for example, could be really important. The other thing that probably drives a lot of fish managers crazy is it might just be that every year is kind of a unicorn, you know? If there are all these different hurdles that walleye have to get across, and any one of them being in the wrong spot means that you get a bad year class, it means every year could be different. So maybe that means we just have to accept some sense of variability and kind of unpredictability in our walleye recruitment and think about that in a more conservative way when we're thinking about management. And the last thing I'll mention is this increasing importance of precipitation. It was only important in the most recent most recent years. Is that a concern? You know, we're projected to get wetter in the state. You know, so if we have increasing precipitation, increasing springtime precipitation, and that's hard on walleye recruitment, do we need to be thinking more about precipitation effects moving forward? We spend a lot of time thinking about temperature in walleye. Precipitation might be a new area of research that we need to think about. Okay, so that's kind of the science side of things, right? But the idea here is that changes in phenology, changes in habitat, changes in extreme events, we're looking at a new fisheries landscape in Wisconsin. So we used to have a lot of cool water species. You think of like the Mount Rushmore of Wisconsin, it's probably something like lake trout, perch, walleye, and I don't have a muskie on here, that's my fault, muskie. So cold or cool water species. And we're moving toward a future of more warm water species, right? So there's the crappie, bluegill, bass, that kind of stuff. Our fish communities are going to start to change because their habitats, their aquatic habitats are warming up. So this leads me to the second part of my talk. We've talked about kind of seasonal disruptions. Now, if I put my DNR hat back on, how are we thinking about this from a management perspective? And we've done some thinking about this, and the DNR and other fisheries managers in the state have decided that it's time to get RAD. Right? Are you guys familiar with RAD yet? I know some of you are. So RAD, if you're not familiar with it, is an acronym. It's great for puns and titles and stuff, so it's catnip for me. But the idea here is that you have when you're faced with a major ecological change, you can resist, accept, or direct that change. So resistance, I think we're all familiar with the resistance, right? We want that to go back to its historical state. We do that a lot in terrestrial ecosystems, right? We're trying to, bring back prairie ecosystems, or think about grazing techniques. We're trying to restore historical landscapes. Acceptance comes in a couple different flavors, and I think the nuance is really important. Sometimes you have to accept change. If the glaciers are melting, there's not a lot that I can do about that, right? I have to accept the fact that glaciers are melting. At a local level. So sometimes you have to accept change. The other aspect of accept is if an ecosystem is changing to something that's okay with you, you can decide to accept that change. This is a cool figure about coral reefs in Florida. What they found is they're losing a lot of their kind of hard-bodied corals and shifting to more soft-bodied corals. But those new corals still provide habitat for fish. People still like to snorkel around soft-bodied corals, right? So that's an okay change that they're allowing to happen in some places. And the third possible avenue you can take is you can direct change. And I think the best example of direct change, which is kind of whole ecosystem change, is right in our backyard. It's the Great Lakes, Lake Michigan, Lake Superior, Lake Huron, for example. So if you're unfamiliar with the history of the Great Lakes, they had a really interesting native community of lake trout, and a bunch of different Cisco species and some other things. Through species invasion, eutrophication, overfishing, we completely collapsed that native fishery, right? We actually extirpated a number of the Cisco species, lake trout as well. And instead of trying to restore that native state, what we decided to do is stock Pacific salmon, right? And do sea lamprey control. And now we have a completely different ecosystem than what we used to have. But people like it. It's a multi-billion-dollar salmon fishery. We're supporting salmon. We're thinking about ways to support things like alewife, these little forage fish. So that's a really good example of direct. Totally new ecosystem, still happy with it. So we asked the question in Wisconsin, well, how rad is our inland fisheries management in the state? That's kind of what I'm going to be talking about here in the last 10 minutes or so. So we went through all of the different climate responses as a wiki fisheries working group and asked, what fits into resist, accept, or direct in our state? And the first thing I'll show you is resist. So we do a ton of resistance in fisheries management in the state of Wisconsin, right? We stock fish all over the place. In some places we try and remove fish we don't want. We do a lot of habitat restoration, especially in streams. We do fisheries management. Maybe we try and get people to harvest more warm water species while protecting cool water species. We protect bright spots, for example. We do all of these different things. And I'll give you one really good example that I think highlights a lot of these different ideas is getting rad at brook trout bright spots. So in the DNR, we started a program where we're trying to identify places that are really good brook trout and protect those brook trout populations. Like I said, brook trout is our only native stream trout in the state, and we're projected to lose something like 2/3 of the habitat in the state. So what can we do to keep those fish on the landscape? So this is a pretty early on in this program, but the DNR Brook Trout Reserves program has kind of 4 big goals. One, find places that are the best brook trout kind of habitat, places we think they're going to be resilient. 2, identify the risks to those populations. 3, do resistance, right? Implement proper management practices to keep those populations going. And 4, do some monitoring. So I know this is really small, but I'll kind of take you through it because we've identified 54 brook trout reserves in the state of Wisconsin so far. These are all kind of on a watershed level. And what we've kind of identified is along the RAD framework. So these green ones are environmentally resilient, right? So these are places where we can resist. It's either protect or try and keep them resilient through resistance actions. These kind of cream ones are naturally vulnerable, where we think they're just going to kind of warm up too much. There's not a lot we can do about them. A lot in the northeast part of the state. That might be accept. What can we do instead of brook trout in those areas? And then Orange is another resistance, so that's vulnerable, but it's rehabilitation opportunities. So places where we think we can do something to keep those brook trout populations going, let's resist. So this is a really good example of doing a lot of resistance and a little bit of accept. So when we go back kind of this triangle, what are the things we're doing to accept fisheries? And we really only kind of thought of one, which is accepting more warm water fisheries. It turns out we do a lot of resistance in the state, and they kind of keep the question marks up here because we're still thinking through what are acceptance strategies for Wisconsin fisheries. And I think the easiest example of that is kind of starting to think through RAD decisions for walleye again. So this is something that's in the Wiki report. So this is kind of looking at a bunch of different lakes. And what I really want you to focus on are these blue bars, right? These are the number of lakes that we think are going to be walleye lakes. And right now we have a fair number of them, but if you project temperatures forward, by 2089 we're going to have almost none. I think it's like 4 walleye lakes, right? We're going to warm up a lot. And a lot of our lakes are going to shift from kind of being cool lakes to these red lakes, these warm lakes. We're shifting from kind of a walleye perch fishery to a bass and bluegill fishery. So what we started to do at the DNR is ask, okay, when do we need to start accepting or directing, and when is it okay to keep resisting? And when do you make decisions about those change points, right? But accept